Is there anything you would have done differently?
We reported a true story.
Our colleague Brian Williams is back in Kuwait City tonight after a close call in the skies over Iraq.
Controversial Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh and questions about Kavanaugh's drinking in the past.
Sean Hannity, come on up, Sean Hannity.
Today, Andrew Cuomo is having a moment.
Hi, I'm Chris Steyerwalt.
And I'm Eliana Johnson.
And welcome to Ink-Stained Wretches, where we break down what's going wrong and what's going right with the American news media. And Eliana Johnson, I got to tell you, I'm not feeling a lot of the going right today. Today, we're recording this the morning after the presidential debate, and I'm not feeling a lot of the going right part of things. So in a perhaps a change of roles, I'm going to look to you today to buoy my
I'm sure
optimism.
I'll excel at that role.
You're just going to lighten me.
Yeah.
You're going to bring a lightness to me.
I'm there for you.
I appreciate that. You are as always a beacon of optimism and hope.
I mean, we're here to talk about the debate, and in terms of format, we're going to talk about the debate on our front page, of course, and move up our obsessions, because our obsessions are debate-centric, and then we'll get to the rest of the media news at the bottom. So let's hit the debate on our front page. This is really only partly about the press. It's also about the Democratic establishment, the White House spokesman, Biden advisors, Democratic lawmakers who have spent the past 2 or 3 years telling us that Biden is up to the job, that he is sprightly, that he's energetic, and over the past couple of months calling videos of him looking confused or feeble pieces of misinformation. And all of that was exploded on the debate stage last night. So in that sense, I guess, Chris, we can get into the performance, but I don't actually really understand the panic, because this is the Biden we've been watching for the past 3.5 years.
Let's say that you had been embezzling at work and you had been getting away with it for years. Years had gone by and you had been stealing, and it got easier and easier to do. And then one day, you open up your laptop and there is an email from the finance department, and it says RE account discrepancy. That is the feeling that Democrats have today. That is the feeling that the boosters in the media have today, because they knew that they were doing the wrong thing. They knew they were doing the wrong thing the whole time, but they kept getting away with it. And the frequency of getting away with it, you can tell the story of...
What does getting away with it mean, though? Because voters have been saying in polls that Biden is too old to do the job. They don't think he's up to the job. On the other hand, they didn't vote for, actually, his primary challenger. So I do see your point.
In 2020, were it not for the coronavirus pandemic and Donald Trump's mangled response to it, Donald Trump would have been reelected. Joe Biden would not have beaten him. In January of 2021, the Democrats would not have taken the Senate, but for Donald Trump crashing into Georgia and ruining the chances for the Republican candidates there. In 2022, Democrats should have taken a pasting. They should have taken an obvious shellacking in the midterms, and yet they did not, because Donald Trump and the Republicans put forward a bunch of cuckoo birds. And then State of the Union this year, 2024. Okay, here it comes. Can he do it? And it was not good, but it was better than people thought. And at each point, Democrats convinced themselves, well, maybe we're getting away with it. Maybe the polls say that he's too old. The polls say that people are concerned. The polls say. But then they look at the results of every special election. They look at the results of the midterms. They look at all this stuff and they say, but maybe Trump's bad enough that we're getting away with it. And last night was the moment where, and I I flagged it's a transcript, I guess, of the discussion that they had at the New York Times that included my colleague Ross Douthat and I think Michelle Cottle, but also most significantly Ezra Klein. And we talked about on this podcast back in February when Ezra Klein, the once enfant terrible of the progressive left, who has become a much more mainstream New York Timesian figure, said, it's time for Biden to go. And he faced a landslide of pressure, huge attacks and pressure, and all of the people who said, how can you say this? And he walked it back. And in the spring, he said, well, okay. I was wrong. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said what I said. And then last night he said, no, not only should I have said what I said, but it's worse than we thought. And he even raises the specter of, which is he very carefully threaded the needle in his first iteration, where he said, oh, he's perfectly fit to be president. He's just not fit to run for president. Now he's back with, actually, he's neither. And that's a significant moment.
To me, this was so predictable in that I thought it was crazy that Democrats were saying, Joe Biden just needs to do what he did at the State of the Union. This is not the same thing. Reading somewhat capably off a teleprompter is not a good comparative exercise to fielding questions that you don't know are coming and debating an adversary on a stage for 90 minutes. It's just not a good comparison. I would think Biden could go out and stumble through another speech. Of course, that's what he does in office, and that's what they've been able to paper over and cover up for. I was not surprised at his catastrophic performance last night, and it really does give the lie. Democrats' argument in this election is that Trump is unfit for office. But what we saw last night is that Biden is not fit for office. And he drove it home by being totally unable to make coherent points on issues that should be strong points for Democrats. So when he was asked about Roe v. Wade, he tried to talk about the 3 trimesters and completely garbled his answer. And then I just want to read the following. This was in response to a question about abortion. And he said, look, there's so many young women who have been, including a young woman who was just murdered. And this is in reference to a 12-year-old who was raped and murdered by an illegal immigrant, that he's changing the subject to talk about something that's a vulnerability. So he says, look, there's so many young women who have been, including a young woman who was just murdered. The idea that she was murdered by an immigrant coming in, and they talk about that. But here's the deal. There's a lot of young women who are being raped by their in-laws, by their spouses, brothers and sisters, period.
I can barely bear to hear it repeated. It was so awful. And, let's remember, if Donald Trump would have debated an empty podium, he would have lost, right? Donald Trump gave an incoherent, dishonest, it was a mangled wreck of a debate. But because Joe Biden...
Trump was fine. Like, he wasn't the over-the-top, blustering, insane man. In terms of Trump's debate performance, grading on the scale of Trump, he was good, which, yes, it's a different scale, but he didn't come off as an insane lunatic.
Well, I would say that for the first 45 minutes of the debate, Trump did a pretty good job of taking the win, right? And his best moment in the debate was when he looked after Biden had whatever car crash Biden had just caused, and Trump said, I don't understand what he was talking about, and frankly, I don't think he does either. Was the best. That was the Trump's high point in the debate. But of course, what did Trump do with the next 45 minutes? Talking about his club championships, talking about just, being Trump. And my point is, if Joe Biden had not shown up and CNN had said, well, the president has not shown up, so Mr. Trump, we're going to stick to our word. We're going to give you this stage. And he had done it alone, it would have been a disaster for Trump. And it is true that Joe Biden did not surmount the extraordinarily low bar that was set for him. And you could say that because Trump did not moon Joe Biden, Trump did not behave as poorly as he did in the first debate of 2020, that he surmounted the low bar. And there's truth in that. What I mean is that Joe Biden made it so easy for Donald Trump. He just made it just stunningly easy for Donald Trump. And I guess Trump should be credited for not, I mean, he had to call him Brandon. You could see Trump struggling within himself to have decorum or be decent in some way. And you could probably hear he could hear the voices of his advisors saying, do not destroy. Please do not destroy.
Yeah, look, Trump had misses too. And I want to say, look, one strong point for Trump, and the place where I thought he missed was when they asked about why are voters have concerns about your age too, and why do you think you're fit for office? And he gave an answer about cognitive tests, and I aced it and all this stuff. And I thought he should have said, look at me on this stage now. Just look at me. Do I look fit or not? And compare me to this man over here who clearly doesn't look fit. That seemed like a gimme that he missed. But there was one answer on January 6th that I couldn't believe when I heard him say on January 6th, on January 6th, 2021, inflation was this. On January 6th, 2021, the world was more peaceful. I couldn't believe that he did not take the bait on that answer. On subsequent questions, he did. But I was shocked when I heard him give a somewhat disciplined answer to that.
No, that was a good answer. But I think, and this is not about the news about the news, but I should just say something that I am committed to saying until people are truly sick of hearing it. This should be a watershed moment for the American electorate to look at these two men and say, our system is broken. It is not working. We had primaries in which neither of these men debated. Neither of them were willing to take the stage with their intra-party opponents. So even the last checks on our dysfunctional parties have been obliterated. And it is unbecoming, it is unworthy of history's greatest republic to have these two people vying to be the chief magistrate of the United States. And I hope that people seal this moment in their hearts and remember that going forward, if we cannot radically reform, substantially improve the way that the parties choose their nominees, we will only have ourselves to blame.
And I do think we should talk about the role of the media in that, which has not aggressively covered. It's hard to say Trump has not been aggressively covered. He has been. Biden, however, and his age issue has not been aggressively covered until about 2 weeks ago when there was a Wall Street Journal piece. The Democrats who tell us that he's in fantastic shape and clobber the Wall Street Journal for writing that piece have not been aggressively covered, nor their incentives for shilling for the White House examined. The White House aides and spokesmen who have made these claims have not been interrogated. So there's the media is part of this as well.
And over at the Post, they did their own version of the Times chat headline on the Washington Post chat, and it's under Alexi McCammon's byline. Did CNN, this is amazing to me, did CNN mishandle the Biden-Trump debate? And the first question, and she was talking to Eugene Robinson and Eric Wemple, was it a mistake for CNN not to fact check the candidates? And of course, Eugene Robinson says, I think so. I think so. It was a cop-out. And the surrender to the difficulty of fact-checking Trump in real time and how correcting his lies would have consumed most of the debate. And McCammon says, I think they abdicated any sort of journalistic duties by not even pushing back on some of Trump's blatantly false claims. They normalized, oh my gosh, his falsehoods by responding with, thank you, Mr. President. And Eric Wemple, who I really admire his I think he's good at what he does. He said, look, the idea behind not having the moderators fact check is that they already have the enormous job of moderating. And in the past, when Trump has been on stage, that has been a near impossible job. Plus, if moderators are fact checking on the fly, they could easily screw up and ruin everything for the network. For media people, I believe we are no closer to cracking the code on whether you can ever allow Trump onto live television under any circumstance whatsoever. The answer remains pretty much no. And it's unfair to Biden to ask him to spend all his time fact checking, which means essentially that he cannot talk about his policies or make his own points. With Trump in a debate, there is no self-cleaning oven. And the effort by McCammon and Robinson to suggest that somehow this is CNN's fault, that somehow, oh, if only CNN, and we get this a lot in left criticism of the media around the coverage of Trump, which is if only the platonic ideal, if only the perfect kind of journalism existed that we like, it would somehow stop Donald Trump from winning. And it's just horse feathers. It's just that I was surprised by two things in the response overall. I was
But
number
can I
one.
just say,
Yeah.
Is it also incumbent on the moderators to push back on Joe Biden and say, I'm sorry, your second sentence did not follow your first sentence. I couldn't understand because you were mumbling or make out what you said. Please, we can't. Also, you're looking off into space. I mean, is it incumbent on them to point out the obvious, or can the American people watch and make up their own minds?
Joy Reid, I believe, was the one who said that it was bad for Biden to be put on screen right, because it made him look like he was looking off into space.
I mean,
No.
right. You know, she's really gotten to the bottom of this. She has cracked the code on Biden debate victory. And
I guess for me, the two big surprises were this kind of, it's actually CNN's fault. Oh, CNN actually did this. I guess I could have foreseen that, but I definitely did not foresee. If you look at the New York Times editorial page today, this is a collective action, right? Frank Bruni, every single voice on the New York Times editorial page today sings out of the same hymnal and says, you got to go. When you can get Tom Friedman to say, you have to go. I was struck and frankly, a little impressed that so many people, once it was clear that the emperor had no clothes, that so many people said, okay, here we are. Let's live in the world as it actually is, instead of saying we're going to get away with embezzling one more day.
should we talk about the pieces?
Do it.
Jonathan Martin has a long piece in Politico magazine about the collective Democratic freakout. And he writes, one House Democrat said he spoke for others in the wake of the president's stunningly feeble debate performance on Thursday. The movement to convince Biden to not run is real. The House member, an outspoken defender of the president, said that House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries and Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer should consider, quote, a combined effort to nudge President Joe Biden out of the race. Crestfallen by the president's weak voice, pallid appearance, and meandering answers, numerous Democratic officials said Biden's bet on an early debate to rebut unceasing questions about his age had not only backfired, but done damage that may prove irreversible. The president had, in the first 30 minutes of the debate, fully affirmed doubts about his fitness.
True. And the Democrats that I'm talking to last night and today, even normie Democrats, are, and look, a lot of this will depend on what the polls say a week from now and where we are on that, and whether or not Biden can go much lower. I don't know how close to his floor Biden was, but if Biden is substantially behind, if this is truly consequential and enough voters say, no, I can't do it. I can't do it. Is there the possibility that a group of Solons, of mandarins of the Democratic Party will, speaking of collective action, find the delegation of people? And I think it's probably Jim Clyburn ought to be one of them, but that go to, because there's nothing Barack Obama's going to say to Joe Biden that's going to get him to do anything differently. But is there a group of people, and I know that I'm the millionth person you've heard make this comparison, but the Barry Goldwater delegation that went to the White House to tell Richard Nixon that he was out, and he had to go. And we should remember that the reason that worked was not because they told Nixon, we think you should go. It was because they told Nixon, if you don't go, we will vote to convict you when you are impeached. We will not support you. And if a group of Democrats went to Joe Biden, led by people who have been his allies and have supported him, and say, if you don't withdraw, we will withdraw our endorsement of your nomination and we will urge the party to have an open convention.
What's your bet? You think it's going to happen?
I think a great deal will depend on what those poll numbers say. And a great deal will depend on, look, the 4th of July, Independence Day holidays coming up. And I would say the most probable outcome is that with the 4th of July holiday interrupting the polling and things being what they will, 10 days, 2 weeks from now, it's simmered back down to whatever. And I think that's more likely. But 2 days ago, I would have said that the chances of Joe Biden not being the Democratic nominee were, 1 in 10. Now I would say it's, 4.8 out of 10. I'd say it's right there. And to continue in my corny, sappy way, I do believe that Joe Biden loves America. I do believe he is a patriotic person. And I said this when he opted to run again, and I will repeat it now. There's just not an excuse for Joe Biden to stay in this. There's no excuse for him to make to stay in this race. There wasn't really one before, but now that it's manifest, and not to give Republican talking points, but what does this say to the world, right? What is having your commander in chief dazed, confused, incoherent, a mess, right? Joe Biden was just a mess, and that won't do.
One of the interesting things, and we should play some of these clips, was watching, there are more than a handful of former Biden aides who now have perches on cable television. Jen Psaki is one of them. Van Jones is another one. And Kate Bedingfield. Let's listen to what those folks had to say, because they weren't, I wouldn't even call it sounding the alarm, but they were not defending that performance. And I would say Van Jones even gave a sort of eulogy for Biden's political career.
Look, it was a really disappointing debate performance from Joe Biden. I don't think there's any other way to slice it. His biggest issue that he had to prove to the American people was that he had the energy, he had the stamina, and he didn't do that. And so I think that is of concern, and I think for a lot of Democrats, that's very disappointing.
I just want to speak from my heart. I love that guy. That's a good man. He loves his country. He's doing the best that he can. But he had a test to meet tonight to restore confidence of the country and of the base, and he failed to do that. And I think there's a lot of people who are going to want to see him consider taking a different course now.
The vice president agreed to come on MSNBC. I don't know if it was long before the debate, perhaps. If it wasn't, you don't send the vice president of the United States out if you won the debate.
So that is not good for Biden. But Chris, I'm 2 in 10 that he's not the nominee. I just don't see how they extract themselves from this. I don't see how they do it.
How they extract? Well, if Joe Biden is determined to remain,
right,
he can remain.
I don't see how. I don't see him pulling out.
I gotta say, I don't see him pulling out unless people lay it on the line for him, right? I don't see him pulling out unless the Jim Clyburns and others of the world come forward and say, and this is the key part, they have to say they're willing to pay a political price themselves in order to make it happen. It's not enough to go in and counsel with him and say, I really think you should. They have to be willing to say, and if you don't, this is what I will do. And Republicans couldn't do that after January 6th, right? They were not able to do that under a more severe circumstance with Donald Trump. They couldn't bring themselves to do it. I think it is less likely than the alternative that the Democrats will do it with Joe Biden. But they might, right? They certainly might. And the possibility exists that Joe Biden would assent. And I think it's not the preponderance of probability, but I think it's a lot higher than it was 2 days ago.
It is a lot higher, but I don't think so. I don't think so. Okay. With that, should we jump to our obsessions of the week?
Obsessed, debate obsessed.
Debate obsessed. Chris, I have a couple of obsessions. They're a pair of obsessions. The first is the Wall Street Journal piece of June 4th, 2024. Behind closed doors, Biden shows signs of slipping. Participants in meetings said the 81-year-old president performed poorly at times. The White House said Biden is sharp and his critics are playing partisan politics. And I just wanted to talk about this again and pull some of the responses to it, including those of cable news talkers and so-called journalists and White House aides who pushed back hard on this story and who are now expressing their alarm over Biden's debate performance, including Joe Scarborough. So Scarborough's response to the Journal story says, and this is from a Deadline piece, Scarborough challenged the account, that's the Wall Street Journal, noting other reporting that McCarthy had told allies that he had found Biden to be mentally sharp in meetings. Scarborough noted that after a May in-person meeting at the White House, McCarthy had praised him. This is the former House Speaker Kevin McCarthy. I have repeatedly stated on air that I am an avid reader and cheerleader for the Wall Street Journal, Scarborough wrote on Twitter. That is what makes this false, biased story so disappointing. It is undermined immediately by the massive weight on the record contradictions. The White House pushed back against the piece shortly after it was posted. Ben LaBault, the White House communications director, said the piece was a quote, utter editorial fail. LaBault wrote, "What a surprise. Republicans employing their election year messaging strategy that contradicts their own prior words about the president, gambling in Casablanca." And I think this just shows the gaslighting by both the press and the White House that has gone on. And it's of a piece with the second part of my obsession, which was a New York Times story on the quote unquote cheap fake videos of June 21st, exactly a week ago. How misleading videos are trailing Biden as he battles age doubts. A flurry of recent clips, many of them edited or lacking context, laid bare a major challenge for the president as he tries to persuade voters he has the energy for a second term. And the 3 Times reporters write that a distorted online version of the president, a product of often misleading videos that play into and reinforce voters' long-standing concerns about the president's age and abilities, are a big issue. In the last 2 weeks, conservative news outlets, the Republican National Committee and the Trump team, have circulated videos of Mr. Biden that lacked important context and twisted mundane moments to paint him in an unflattering light. Among other things, they created the impression that the president wandered off during a meeting with other group of G7 leaders, an image that the New York Post ran on its front page, that he was escorted out of an event by his wife, Jill Biden, while President Emmanuel Macron of France stayed behind to greet veterans, struggled to sit down at a D-Day commemorations ceremony, and then they argue how these were all fake, you didn't see what you saw, etc., etc. All of this stuff was just pure gaslighting of people that was totally ineffective because then they had to put the guy out there and let people see him in full for 90 minutes. And I wanted to talk about this because I just thought it exposed both lawmakers, the White House's, and the media's role in putting Joe Biden up to run again in 2024.
How about the Her report? How about
report?
The reaction to the Her report.
Everybody piled on. Yes. Yeah.
Are you going to believe me or your own lying eyes? Right? Are you going to believe this? And again, I get partisan spinning. Republicans do it with Trump. Everybody does it with everybody. You're going to spin the best that you can. But the New York Times and other outlets that have given life and form to the obviously untrue concept that somehow there is an awesome Joe Biden somewhere, right? That we can't see him. We don't know the truth of Joe Biden, that he is killing it. He's awesome. And the efforts that have been made to prop that up have been journalistic malpractice, no doubt.
Chris, what is your obsession?
Before I obsess, I do want to ask you relatedly, how do you think CNN did?
I thought it was pretty good. I thought it was a miss not to ask Biden about his claims about Hunter Biden's laptop and the lies he has told. But I was pretty impressed in the first 45 minutes, I have to say. I thought that they both fielded tough questions, which is the job. What did you think?
I would say the fact that they did not get to Biden's obvious infirmity until the very end, late in the debate. And the same with January 6th. They got to January 6th sooner, but I can tell you right now that if I were part of the process of this debate, I would not have started with, what about inflation? And I wouldn't have started with that. I can tell you what the first two questions I would have drafted would have been. My question to Joe Biden would have been to read him 4 or 5 utterly mangled things that he said, right? And say, how can you tell the American people that you at age 81 are, and you'd find another quote where he said, I'm as good as I've ever been, or whatever his most robust defense of his performances, and say, how can you say that that is true given what we've seen? And I would have done that to Biden. I would have given him high heat right off the bat. And to Trump, it would have been a very simple question: who won the 2020 election? And that's where I would have started. And I would have let it rock. I would have let the debate go. And I understand why CNN did not want to do that for a variety of reasons. Some good, some self-interested. I understand the argument against that, and I understand why in the room I probably would have been shouted down, like, no, we're not doing that. We got to try to keep this on the rails. I get it, but I would have liked to have seen tougher questioning.
I understand. I think there's totally a case to be made for that, but I actually don't think you needed to ask Biden about his age. Show don't tell.
I know, but
I realized
by the time she got to the question, by the time they
didn't need to ask it at all.
Question,
it was like stupid to ask it at the end. And frankly, if I had the question on like a number 3 question, I would have been like, this is a waste of time when we had limited time. Like the question has answered itself.
I would have still, if I were in the truck, I would have gotten in your ear and told you not to kill the question. I would have told you to move it up. I would have said, this is really too obvious for the audience at home. You need to move question 31 up to question 4 because it was just too, it was too effulgent.
It was so obvious, but I didn't leave because of what happened. I didn't leave thinking, oh my gosh, why didn't they ask it? Just because of the way things played out. It didn't feel like such a big miss to me.
Yeah, well, one thing we can for sure agree, the time to ask that question, if it was to be asked at all, was not at the 1 hour and 15 minute mark.
I agree.
Okay. My obsession, if I may obsess, is, I love Kevin Williamson. He is, Kevin Williamson, my colleague at the Dispatch, my friend, is very often the writer that I wish that I had the courage to be, and very often wish that I had Kevin and I play different roles in the universe. I'm an analyst. I host a political talk show. I do different things than Kevin does. Kevin is a pure opinion monger, and he is free in that way. But very often I am envious of Brother Williamson. And he wrote a piece for the Dispatch headlined, "It's time for radical candor." And I think this applies to the debate. So it's time for Radical Candor. Subhead: We are governed by imbeciles and thieves and miscreants and degenerates. And so Kevin goes through. So there's a little premise in journalism. So there's a guy named Aaron Dimmick who is running against Matt Gaetz. And what you do if you're Aaron Dimmick is to say the things that you need to say in order to win the primary, but you say it with a wink, and you get a pass from people who would like Matt Gaetz to fail. So I'm sure that when Aaron Dimmick's communications director said, hey, the Dispatch wants to do an interview, Kevin Williamson from the Dispatch wants to interview you about this race, it's pretty obvious. Kevin Williamson has said bone-crushingly, achingly brutal things about Matt Gaetz. So you figure, oh, okay, here's the game. They're going to write a piece of flattering of me, and it will help me raise money and gain attention in a race that I'm unlikely to win. And what he got instead was the most savage, brutal. I mean, I can only imagine that congressional candidate Aaron Dimmick had to fire his communications director after this came out. So here's what Kevin writes. And the gag in the piece is that Aaron Dimmick has given speeches in which he ascribes to the leadership philosophy of radical candor that is common in companies today, where you're allowed to say anything to anybody, get the truth out there. Who cares about hurt feelings? We've got to be honest with each other. And he says this, but we could really use some damn radical candor because we are governed by imbeciles and thieves and miscreants and degenerates and people who are willing to put up with all that imbecility and thievery and miscreants and degeneracy if it gets them even such a pathetic prize as a temporary seat in the U.S. House of Representatives, serving on behalf of the lovely folks who have freely chosen Matt Gaetz, of all bipedal things, as their man in Washington. I don't know that my own personal soul is worth all that much, but I'd expect more than that in trade. And so here endeth the candidate profile. Good luck, Aaron Dimmick, radical candor coach, and gormless Trump sycophant. You're going to lose for nothing. I may not have a gigantic readership, but this probably will be the most read thing ever written about you. And it would have been better if you could have worked up the manhood to say what you and I both know to be obviously, and I mean illuminated by Klieg lights, obviously true. It isn't easy ending up the weasel in a story in which Matt Gaetz figures prominently. And I mean, wow, just wow. And my obsession is, it is time for radical candor from more people. It is time for Democrats to be more radically candid about Joe Biden. It's time for Republicans to be more radically candid about Donald Trump. It's time for us as Americans to be more radically candid about the state of our politics and our parties.
All right, Chris. In our out of order episode, should we get to our business news? We have a lot to discuss in Washington Post news.
Yep.
The major piece here was really Brian Stelter's 9,000 word piece in The Atlantic.
Okay.
That ran yesterday. And the upshot of it is bringing this back to Jeff Bezos. And the big scoop in it's not really a big scoop, is that Bob Woodward had appealed to Jeff Bezos to please get more involved in all of this. And the point of the piece is that with all of the drama happening at this paper, he's really responsible for it. And for all the talk of Will Lewis and this and that and the other, I think it's an effort to bring it back to the man in charge.
The breaking news that came over the transom right before we started recording was the Washington Post's internal effort to destroy the incoming, or to destroy the new publisher of their paper. Headline: Post publisher's role in hacking response comes into sharper focus. And this is a 4 byline piece with the photo, a picture of Rupert Murdoch and Will Lewis, and a scathing account of Lewis's role in helping cover up the phone hacking scandal that has been either the central complaint or the fictive rationalization for why they are opposed to him. But they dropped this one on his head, and it's pretty tough because it includes the claim that Lewis was the one who gave the go-ahead to the destruction of emails that were part of the investigation. Here's what Lewis has denied wrongdoing while declining to answer detailed questions about his actions. He told the Post, "I know I did nothing wrong, and these allegations are untrue." He has previously called his assignment at the time crisis management and said he worked to preserve journalistic integrity. Can he possibly survive? His handpicked guy, I think we talked about this last week, his handpicked guy.
Yeah, Rob Winnett.
He bowed out, and he's going to stay at the Telegraph in London. And I love the Telegraph's very British response. We think he's a fine chap and glad to keep him. Cheerio. And he's going to stay put and not come into the buzzsaw. Do you think there is a world in which Will Lewis remains as the publisher of the Washington Post?
I do. I do think there's a world in which he does. And again, it goes back to Jeff Bezos and how intent he is on staying the course with this. Look, it's one thing to lose $77 million a year, and I guess they're on track to lose another $50 million this year.
Ooh.
It's another thing to lose that money and then have the little turds who you're employing at that cost intentionally frustrate your management decisions. And I think it would be hard for Bezos to change course at this point. That is my take.
I think it would be hard for you to change course. I think you would burn that mother down before you crumbled. But as we've seen with Chris Licht at CNN, and we've seen a number of times, when things get ugly and things get expensive and things get complicated, people who should know better say, look, not your fault. This is really unfair, and I get it, but we're just going to have, it's become a distraction. And I hope you'll understand the way that in politics, people are gotten rid of all the time, right? Somebody comes to them and says, it's not your fault, but you have to go. The Zoe Bairds of the world, it's not your fault, but you have to go. And my guess is that Bezos is not going to do what would be necessary to keep Lewis, because what would be necessary in order to keep Lewis would be a brutal fight, a purge within his own a newsroom divided against itself cannot stand, and a newsroom that includes both, what's the name of the social media reporter they hired from the Times?
Taylor Lorenz.
A newsroom that includes Taylor Lorenz and Will Lewis cannot stand.
And so they're going to get rid of Will Lewis? Oh, yeah. It's real recipe for success.
But there's nothing in Jeff Bezos's time at the Washington Post. Now, there's lots of stuff at Amazon that tells me he would. But so far, I have not seen anything at the Washington. So maybe you're right about Biden. Maybe I'm wrong about Will Lewis and Jeff Bezos, because we're sort of taking opposite takes on these situations. Because it's hard to do the hard thing. That's why people don't do that's why people very often don't do the hard thing. And I think they may have just screwed this up enough that it will be the fail fast attitude of Silicon Valley will say, we can't just keep sitting here and rotting. We've got to start over.
Well, we'll come back to this.
We will come back to it.
I'll lord my correctness over you.
And by the way, I kind of hope you're right. Not that I have any brief for Will Lewis, but I kind of hope that you're right, that Jeff Bezos says, I have to hold the line, right?
Yeah.
I gotta stick, because if they run me off on this, I'll never
be able to run the place.
Get that back. Yeah, I'll never be able to run the place if I don't make this stick. And so we will see. Now, your boy, Matthias Dipfner, the long and fascinating head of Axel Springer,
Yeah.
bought Politico. And when he bought Politico, when Axel Springer bought Politico, there was upset at Politico, right? These are pro-Israel people. These are
The horror.
These are moderates. These are maybe even conservative. They surfaced the stuff about Dupfner and mocking people for their opposition to Donald Trump. And there was a pretty concerned. Now, look, Politico ain't the Washington Post, which is kind of damning with faint praise. Sorry.
Yeah.
But the effort to scandalize Dupfner and Axel Springer and create all this anxiety around Politico, and then it went away. It was like, okay, I guess moving on. And then I read with real interest the piece in Semaphore about the top tier departures at Politico. And I have a premise, which is Axel Springer is successfully reforming Politico. And I hate to see Jack Schaefer leave at Politico for what it says about Politico, but Jack Schaefer will land very well. Anybody would be very lucky to have Jack Schaefer as their media critic. And if he has any interest, I've got some places that'd hire him. But
he is the best.
He's great, and he's independent minded, and he's all that stuff. And my premise is that actual change is taking place, but very gradually and very intentionally at Politico. And these voluntary departures are reflective of the success of an approach very different than the one that we have seen at the Washington Post.
I don't share that view. There are changes happening at Politico. I don't think they are due to the Axel Springer ownership. I think they are due to some of the Politico side senior staff, and the Semaphore piece mentioned Alex Burns, who came to Politico from the Times, and he's been empowered by John Harris, who's one of the founders. And I think that if Axel were behind it, we would be seeing more changes along the lines of, I think the coverage would be a little bit more pro-Israel. Politico's been one of the worst on the Israel-Gaza issue. And I think I trace a lot of these departures back to Harris's decision to empower Alex Burns as the head of news at Politico. And I don't think that had anything to do with Axel.
And I'm more than willing to believe that is also true, right? That there are changes going on at Politico, and that the specific personnel moves about Harris and Burns and those things have antagonized people. But I do think there's something happen that I don't think that the two things are totally unrelated. And the Burns and Harris piece of it may be more of it or than I think, but I think there's something going on there. So we will also watch that. We will also watch that because I think Politico a year from now is going to look different than it does today.
Okay, Chris, that brings us to my favorite time of the week, which is reader mail. And we have a note from Joe Vaughn in Spartanburg, South Carolina, and he writes, "Dear Chris and Eliana, I came across this aisle at my local Hobby Lobby this evening and could not believe I was looking at real products for sale. I later realized that someone must be trying, albeit mistakenly, to market products specifically tailored to listeners of this podcast, consumers who love trash food, but who are also interested in cosmetics and beauty products. I foresee another product testing episode on the way. Thanks, as always, for the very informative and entertaining podcast. Keep up the great work." And
holy
wait,
cannolis.
I can't open the pictures.
Someone has introduced a line of beauty products that are branded to snack foods. This is meant for you. Who did you do this? Are you behind this? It is Cheetos branded and Doritos branded.
Oh
Beauty
my
masks.
gosh, this is amazing. Now I see them. This is so cool.
We've got a Doritos scented face mask, Cheetos. This is I will tell you now that I will do, even on camera, would you do a Doritos or a Cheetos? Would you choose Doritos or Cheetos
Doritos.
scented beauty mask? Yeah, I think it'd be Doritos. If it was Cool Ranch, that's easy. But wow, Joe Vaughn of Spartanburg, South Carolina. Wow. I say unto you, wow, and thank you.
Okay, that's great. Our next letter is from John Retzer in Michigan, and John writes, I grew up in D.C. in the 1970s reading WaPo. I was inspired by WaPo to get a degree in journalism from West Virginia. My grandfather was a professor there. I subscribed to WaPo during my years in D.C. working for the Heritage Foundation. After I moved to Michigan in the mid-1990s to teach high school, government and economics, I got a digital subscription as soon as it was available. I'm like Steyerwalt in reverse, D.C. to West Virginia to Michigan. The recent unpleasantness at WaPo has convinced me that toddlers are running the nursery and that trying to parse out the facts from their imaginations is no longer worth the effort. I'd hoped that an adult might be in charge when it appeared they would bring in the guy from the Telegraph. What are my reasonable alternatives for a serious daily news source that covers national politics, policy, the economy, international events, and on occasion does interesting, in-depth reporting? I'm pretty sure it's not the New York Times, or maybe it is. Love the show. Thanks. John,
I love it.
my pick would be the Wall Street Journal.
Yeah, I tell people of means and people of some erudition that they can choose. They have choices when it comes to which is their main feedstock of news and information. And they have two choices, right? You can do the New York Times or you can do the Wall Street Journal if you only want to do one. I do both. You do both. People in the business do both. But if you're going to do one, because the subscriptions are expensive. The Wall Street Journal subscription is a real meat grinder of, I forget what it is now, but it's hundreds and hundreds of dollars to subscribe to the Wall Street Journal. So I don't offer it lightly. But I do think if you want to be an informed person, you should pick one of those two. And I kind of think, and this is me being me, I kind of think if you're right of center, you should do the Times. And if you're left of center, you should do the Journal, just so that you're going to get your thinking checked. But Mr. Retzer, you have identified the problem with the Washington Post. If you subscribe to the New York Times, you can figure out what the story is, even when bias interferes, right? You may have to sort through it. They may bury the lead by your point of view. You may say like, oh, this is whatever. And as we do every week, we find those examples. But you can get to the story. The Washington Post, I think if you relied on the Washington Post alone to get your mainstay of national and international news, I think it would be short of the mark.
Chris, that brings us to your favorite time of the week, where I am forced to say something nice. But please, you first. Lead by example.
This is the New York Post leaves a lot to be desired on political news and a lot of national news. And I freely acknowledge that. But when the New York Post does what the New York Post is meant to do, made to do, which is local news and crime news in New York, it is, when it's good, it's very good. So here's the headline. Genovese mobster Tony Cakes ID'd as NYC pedestrian 86 decapitated by DOT truck. Now, I don't know what the headline in the print edition was. I hope it was a lot better than that. But the heart of this story from the lead, it was La Crossing Nostra, the 86-year-old man who was decapitated by a truck that plowed into him at a Brooklyn crosswalk, is a former acting captain of the Genovese crime family. The Post can exclusively reveal. Anthony Conigliaro, a one-time mafioso known as Tony Cakes, Tony the Dessert Man, among other dessert-themed sobriquets, died June 12th in an accidental hit by a city Department of Transportation truck. His lawyers and law enforcement sources said he spent his, this is where, I mean, I assume this quote is I assume that the reporter workshopped this quote with their source, but here it is. He spent his life looking over his shoulder, but he forgot to look both ways before crossing the street, one police source said.
So good.
It's just great. Just couldn't hardly be better. And I say to you, New York Post, this is your moment to shine. This is your time.
All right, Chris, my favorite item was a long piece in the New Yorker on John Fetterman and a serious look at his star turn since October 7th, really. And it's titled John Fetterman's War. Is the Pennsylvania senator trolling the left or offering a way forward for Democrats? And it takes a look at some of the serious substantive points he's making in a really interesting way, I thought. And I'll just read a little bit. We have a destructive fringe that's unhelpful, Fetterman said of his party, and I'm living that now with Israel. But his frustrations with the left, he went on, preceded the war. Years ago, I became more and more appalled at the progressive, whether it's abolish ICE or defund the police, all these kinds of bizarre boutique views, like here's another toy for Republicans to play with. Now Trump was competitive in the polls, and the left's invective was directed at Fetterman. We are in a mad season of the Democratic Party, he said. We're turning against ourselves instead of realizing that we don't have the luxury of effing around. Super interesting, and I think useful for a publication like The New Yorker to take him seriously like this.
Yeah, I think I love the long and ever fascinating tale of John Fetterman.
That is all the time we have for the news about the news. This has been Ink-Stained Wretches from Nebulous Media. Oh, wait. If you have a story that you want us to talk about, email us at nebulouspodcast.com. That's Wretches at nebulouspodcasts.com. And sign up for our newsletter at nebulouspodcasts.com. This has been Ink-Stained Wretches from Nebulous Media, produced by Colin Chicola. Find us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. Just search for Wretches.